Hello BBN. Mark Mitchell files lawsuit with Louisville for another year of eligibility and to enter the transfer portal. And he filed an injunction in Kentucky. Could these shares, if granted, benefit Kentucky in any way? Let's see what's new. Mark Mitchell is seeking another season of college eligibility and at the same time is trying to gain the freedom to enter the transfer portal. And there is one detail in this story that immediately stands out for anyone following Kentucky. The lawsuit was filed in Louisville, and according to Matt Jones of KSR, Mitchell is among the players seeking an injunction that would allow him to compete again during the 2026-27 season. The most interesting part is that any injunction issued in this case would apply only in Kentucky. That changes the scope of the situation quite a bit, because we're talking about a player Kentucky knows very well, a player who faced the Wildcats twice last season and delivered extremely strong performances in both games. And if Mitchell is granted the injunction and becomes available to transfer, Kentucky could potentially be in a position to pursue a player who has already shown exactly the kind of impact he can have against the Wildcats. But before we start imagining Mitchell wearing a Kentucky uniform, it's important to understand what is happening in court, why he is seeking another season, and, most importantly, why the location of this lawsuit could be so significant for Kentucky. According to the lawsuit, Mitchell played for Duke during the 2022-23 and 2023-24 seasons. He then transferred to Missouri, where he played during the 2024-25 and 2025-26 seasons. Now, Mitchell is arguing that he should have the opportunity to compete for an additional season in 2026-27. The reasoning presented in the lawsuit is connected to how players from the 2022 recruiting class have been treated. The case argues that those athletes are being treated unfairly because players from earlier classes received an additional season of eligibility because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is at the heart of the legal dispute. Mitchell and the other plaintiffs are seeking a restraining order and an injunction. The argument is that, without that intervention, they could suffer immediate and irreparable harm by being unable to compete during the 2026-27 season. There is another important detail here. The lawsuit states that Mitchell competed against several players who received additional seasons of eligibility. According to the filing, some of those athletes went on to play 5 or even 6 college seasons. From a perspective presented in the lawsuit, that strengthens the argument that players from the 2022 class are being placed in a different position from athletes in earlier classes. And while this legal battle is taking place, there's also a practical issue for Mitchell. The lawsuit says that he is uncertain where he would play if he is granted another season of eligibility. At the same time, his ability to communicate with coaches is currently limited by NCAA rules. So this is not simply a player who decided to enter the transfer portal and is now considering his options. The situation is different. First, Mitchell needs to secure the additional eligibility. Then there is the issue of whether he can enter the transfer portal and communicate freely with interested programs. That is exactly where the situation becomes especially interesting for Kentucky. Matt Jones of KSR pointed out that Mitchell's involvement in this lawsuit could be significant for Kentucky because any injunction issued in the case would apply only within Kentucky. That detail is extremely important. If an injunction is granted in the Louisville case, the result could create a specific opportunity within the state. And because Kentucky is directly part of that environment, the Wildcats could potentially benefit from the situation. But it's important to make one thing absolutely clear. This does not mean Mitchell is going to Kentucky. It also does not mean Kentucky has already reached an agreement with him. What exists right now is a possibility that could emerge if certain conditions are met. And that possibility becomes even more interesting when we look at the player Mitchell was last season. With Missouri, Mitchell averaged 18.3 points, 5.2 rebounds, and 3.6 assists per game. He also shot 54.7% from the field and 38.8% from three-point range. Those numbers help explain why his situation deserves attention. Mitchell would not simply be another player looking for an opportunity to remain in college basketball. He is coming off a season in which he produced significantly on offense and showed efficiency as a shooter. And there is one aspect of this story that makes everything even more interesting for Kentucky fans. Mitchell has already shown on the court that he can cause problems for the Wildcats. Last season, Missouri went into Rupp Arena and pulled off a surprising 73-68 victory over Kentucky. And Mitchell played a direct role in that result. He scored 21 points, handed out 4 assists, and grabbed 1 rebound. It was an important performance in one of the most notable matchups between the two programs. But what happened later made the situation even more interesting. Kentucky had a chance to get revenge in the SEC tournament. The Wildcats did get that revenge, but even then, Mitchell once again produced a huge performance. This time, he scored 32 points and grabbed 7 rebounds. He made 13 of 21 shots from the field and went 2-for-2 from three-point range. So, in 2 games against Kentucky last season, Mitchell demonstrated an offensive ability that cannot simply be ignored. And that is exactly why this lawsuit deserves close attention from Kentucky fans. Not only because Mitchell could potentially earn another season, but because there is a specific circumstance that could put Kentucky in an interesting position if the injunction is granted. Now, there is a natural question. If Mitchell gets that opportunity, what happens next? The lawsuit says he currently does not know where he would play if he receives another season of eligibility. That means his future remains completely open. And that opening is what could interest Mark Pope directly. If Mitchell is granted an injunction in Kentucky and gains the ability to access the transfer portal, Kentucky could become an important option for the veteran forward. Again, this is a possibility, not a decision that has already been made. There is no confirmation in the information presented that Mitchell has chosen Kentucky or that an agreement is close. But the fact that the legal situation could create a specific opportunity within the state gives the Wildcats a reason to monitor the case closely. There is also the familiarity factor. Mitchell has already played against Kentucky in 2 important situations and performed at a high level in both games. He knows what it is like to play at Rupp Arena. He knows what it is like to face Kentucky. And on the other side, the Wildcats know exactly what kind of player he can be when he has opportunities to produce offensively. That does not determine where he would transfer, but it certainly makes the possibility interesting if he becomes available. It is also important to remember that this situation is not only about Kentucky. The lawsuit involves the right of Mitchell and other players from the 2022 class to receive an additional season of eligibility. The argument is broader and concerns how different classes of players were treated following the pandemic. So any decision in this case could have significance for the athletes involved. In Mitchell's specific situation, there's another layer, the possibility of being able to communicate with coaches and eventually determine where he would play. For now, those conversations are limited by NCAA rules, according to the lawsuit. So there is a natural sequence to this story. First comes the decision on the injunction. Then, if the injunction is granted, the question of eligibility and what opportunities that would create for Mitchell. And only after that could there be more concrete movement regarding his next destination. That is exactly why the decision from Judge Brian Edwards will be closely watched. Matt Jones also noted that Edwards could be favorable toward the players involved in the case. That adds another interesting element to the situation, although there is still no guarantee about the outcome. And here is the most important point for Kentucky. The Wildcats do not need the entire situation to be resolved right now for it to matter. The fact that there's a lawsuit in Louisville with a potential injunction that would apply in Kentucky, already creates a scenario that Kentucky can monitor closely. If Mitchell gets what he is seeking, he could earn another opportunity to play during the 2026 to 27 season. And if that opportunity comes with the ability to enter the transfer portal and communicate with programs, Kentucky could have a chance to evaluate the player and potentially try to convince him to join the Wildcats. That is where Mark Pope comes into the picture. Pope could potentially have the opportunity to pursue a player who had a productive season at Missouri, who has previous experience at Duke, who has already faced Kentucky at a high level, and who has demonstrated the ability to score efficiently. But once again, it is important to separate possibility from reality. Right now, Mitchell is seeking an injunction. His legal situation still needs to be resolved. The case is still ongoing, and there is no confirmation that he will play for Kentucky. What does exist is a path that, if certain decisions go Mitchell's way, could eventually put the Wildcats in a very interesting position. And perhaps that is the most important part of this entire story. A piece of news that initially appears to be only about one player's eligibility could have a much more direct connection to Kentucky because of where the lawsuit was filed and because of the possibility that an injunction could apply specifically within the state. For Mark Pope, that means monitoring every development closely. For Kentucky, it means that a player who gave the Wildcats problems last season could, under certain circumstances, become a potential target for the program itself. And for Mitchell, the issue is even bigger. He is trying to secure the right to play another college season. For now, nobody knows exactly how this story will end. What we do know is that Mark Mitchell is seeking another opportunity for 2026 to 27, that his lawsuit includes an attempt to obtain an injunction in Kentucky, and that if that measure is granted, the Wildcats could potentially gain an opportunity that does not concretely exist today. After a season in which Mitchell scored 21 points against Kentucky at Rupp Arena and then put up 32 points in the SEC tournament, it is easy to understand why his situation deserves special attention. Now, the next step is not on the court. It is in the hands of the court. And depending on what happens in Louisville, that decision could determine whether Kentucky simply watches Mark Mitchell from a distance once again, or whether Mark Pope gets the opportunity to try to bring him to the Wildcats for the 2026 to 27 season. There is a different kind of anticipation in Lexington right now. Well, Stein's arrival represents a major change for Kentucky, but it also puts the new head coach in one of the most difficult situations possible to begin his first season as a head coach. And perhaps the most important part of this story is not only what Kentucky does on the field, but how the Big Blue Nation reacts when the results start to come in. Stein arrives at the program after a long tenure under Mark Stoops. Stoops accomplished important things during his time at Kentucky, but the change happened because the program needed to begin a new chapter. And for many fans, there is an especially interesting element to this decision. Stein grew up as a Kentucky fan. That creates a natural connection with the fan base and helps explain why there is so much excitement surrounding this new era. But there's a question that could test that excitement very quickly. Kentucky's schedule is extremely demanding, particularly during the first half of the season. The Wildcats will play 9 SEC games, with 5 of them coming on the road. And when we look at the stretch of opponents Stein will face early in the season, it becomes clear that the early results may not necessarily reflect what fans should expect from the new head coach. That is exactly why the Big Blue Nation needs to be patient. Well, Stein's first season in Lexington will not be easy. In fact, there is a realistic scenario in which Kentucky struggles through a significant portion of the schedule that needs to be understood before anyone makes a final judgment about Stein's work. The problem begins with the way the toughest games are distributed. Kentucky will not have the luxury of slowly building confidence before facing some of the biggest challenges of the season. Instead, The Wildcats will encounter major SEC opponents in a sequence that could quickly change the perception of the season depending on the results. Alabama comes to Lexington. Then Kentucky travels to Texas A&M. After that, the Wildcats head to South Carolina. Then Lane Kiffin and LSU come to Lexington, followed by a trip to Oklahoma. That is a stretch that would challenge any team, and especially a coach taking his first head coaching job. And here's the point that deserves the most attention. There's a scenario in which Kentucky loses all 5 of those games. If that happens, the Wildcats could enter the final 5 games of the season with a 2-5 record. That is exactly when the reaction of the fan base could become extremely important for the environment around the program. Because a 2-5 record would obviously be frustrating. Nobody wants to look at the standings and see more losses than wins, especially after all the excitement surrounding the arrival of a new head coach. And there is another factor. Once basketball season arrives and begins taking over the attention of Kentucky fans, it would be very easy for some people to simply shift their focus. But giving up at that point would mean ignoring the way the schedule is structured. Kentucky's final 5 games are considerably more favorable, and that could completely change the story of the season. The first of those games will be Vanderbilt at home. Then Kentucky travels to Tennessee. After that, Florida comes to Lexington. Then the Wildcats travel to Missouri, before Louisville comes to Lexington to close the regular season. It is important to make one thing clear. Calling this stretch easier does not mean these games will be easy. Every one of these opponents can be competitive. Tennessee could struggle this season, but Kentucky will still have to face the Volunteers on the road. Vanderbilt, Florida, Missouri, and Louisville also present different challenges. So there is no guarantee that Kentucky will simply turn this stretch into a perfect run. But there is an important difference in how this portion of the schedule looks compared with what comes before it. And that difference could be exactly what keeps Stein's season alive. Imagine the situation. Kentucky goes through that brutal stretch of SEC games and reaches the final part of the season with a 2-5 record. For anyone looking only at the win-loss record, the season might look disappointing. But if the fan base considers the opponents Kentucky has already faced, and especially the schedule still ahead, the perspective changes. There would still be a real opportunity for Kentucky to turn things around. That is why the Big Blue Nation cannot simply give up on Stein if the early results are disappointing. The first season of a head coach does not have to be defined by the worst point of the campaign. And in this case, there is a specific reason to look beyond a difficult start. Kentucky will have a stretch at the end of the season in which the Wildcats can potentially pick up some wins. That may be the most important point in this entire discussion. Stein is entering a difficult situation, but he's also taking over a program with a highly engaged fan base. Expectations are high precisely because there is excitement surrounding the change. Stein is not simply another coach arriving in Lexington. He grew up as a Kentucky fan, and that makes this new chapter particularly meaningful for the Big Blue Nation. At the same time, the reality of the schedule needs to be respected. It would not be fair to look at a potential 2-5 record and immediately conclude that Stein is not ready for the job. Not when 5 of Kentucky's biggest challenges are concentrated in such a difficult stretch. Alabama, Texas A&M, South Carolina, LSU, and Oklahoma represent a run that could put Kentucky in an uncomfortable position very quickly. And that is exactly why the fan base will need patience. If Kentucky loses some of those games, the frustration will be understandable. But the season will not end there. There will still be a significant portion of the schedule remaining, and the final 5 games could give Stein an opportunity to show how Kentucky responds after facing some of the toughest challenges of the year. That also places an important responsibility on the new head coach. Stein will have to keep Kentucky competitive during the most difficult part of the season and then take advantage of the final stretch to try to build a strong finish. If the Wildcats can win some of those games, the evaluation of Stein's first season could look very different from what it might have looked earlier in the year. And there is another important detail. Even if Kentucky reaches the final 5 games with a 2-5 record, a bowl game would still be in play. That means a season that might look nearly finished to some fans could still take a completely different direction. This is where patience from the Big Blue Nation becomes so important. This is not about ignoring bad results or pretending losses do not matter. It is about understanding the context before making a final judgment. Stein is beginning his first head coaching job at a time when the schedule offers very little room for a comfortable start. And that could create a very interesting situation. Kentucky could play some of its toughest games very early, and because of that, accumulate losses before getting the opportunity to face a more favorable stretch. If that happens, the fan base needs to look at the entire schedule rather than focusing only on the record at that particular moment. Because Kentucky's season could essentially be built in 2 very different parts. The first part is defined by extremely difficult challenges. The second provides an opportunity for a comeback. And that changes how we should view Stein's potential start. It would not be surprising if the first season presented difficulties. What matters most will be watching how Kentucky responds to those difficulties and how the Wildcats take advantage of the opportunities that come later in the schedule. The stretch against Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Florida, Missouri, and Louisville could end up being extremely important in shaping the perception of Stein's first season. Not because those games are easy, but because they provide a different opportunity after such a difficult opening stretch. And naturally, the final game against Louisville adds even more importance to the end of the season. Kentucky will have the opportunity to close the campaign in Lexington against Louisville. But before reaching that point, Stein will have to navigate every challenge that comes before it. That is exactly why expectations need to be accompanied by patience. Well, Stein's arrival is an important moment for Kentucky. He takes over after the long tenure of Mark Stoops, in a coaching change that fans were ready to embrace. There is excitement because Stein grew up as a Kentucky fan, and now he has the opportunity to lead the program. But the first season will not be defined simply by the excitement surrounding the change. It will be defined by the way Kentucky handles an extremely difficult schedule. And if the Wildcats reach a point in the season with more losses than wins, the Big Blue Nation needs to remember that. The schedule was built in a way that places some of the biggest challenges directly in Kentucky's path early in the season. A 2-5 record would be difficult to accept, but it would still leave Kentucky with 5 important games remaining and a real opportunity to change the direction of the season. That is why the fan base cannot give up too early. The goal is not to create unrealistic expectations. There is no guarantee that Kentucky will win every game in the final stretch. The context itself shows that Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Florida, Missouri, and Louisville will all be competitive opponents. But there is an opportunity. And for a coach beginning his first head coaching job, opportunities like this can be extremely important. Well, Stein will have to show that he can guide Kentucky through a difficult schedule, keep the group focused, and take advantage of the games in which the Wildcats have better opportunities to compete. If he can do that, the story of the season could look very different from what the early results might suggest. At the end of the day, perhaps that is the main message for the Big Blue Nation. Do not judge the Will Stein era solely by the first few results. Kentucky will have a difficult season. The schedule makes that clear. The early SEC games could put the Wildcats in a difficult position and could even create a scenario where Kentucky reaches the final stretch with a 2-5 record. But the season does not end there. There will still be 5 important games, an opportunity to respond, and a chance to keep the path to a bowl game alive. That is why the Big Blue Nation needs to stay behind Kentucky throughout the entire season and give Stein the opportunity to take this first year all the way to the finish. The coaching change has created a new chapter for the program, and now Kentucky will have to navigate a difficult schedule before we know exactly what this new era can become. If Stein can guide Kentucky through that stretch and find some wins late in the season, the overall context of the campaign could be far more positive than the early results might make it appear. And that is exactly why, when the season gets difficult, the message to the fan base should be simple. It is not time to give up on Stein and the Wildcats.